Those of you who have listened to my interviews will have heard me mention my good friend, Dr. Ronald Kapp. And Dr. Ron, as I call him, is one of my sources for medical information that I sometimes touch upon in my writings. In my book, A Master's Guide to the Way of the Warrior, I talk about the nervous system, the endocrine system, and many facets of anatomy. When I write this material, I first research the hell out of it. Then I run it by Dr. Ron for fact-checking and further research ideas. Last week we were talking, and I brought up my pet peeve that I call the tyranny of words. Why do words have such a huge impact on human behavior? I cite one of innumerable possible examples: the First World War. What motivated 500,000 American farm boys and bakers' sons to travel 6,000 miles to brutally butcher 500,000 German farm boys and bakers' sons that had never harmed a hair on an American head? Now, after 100 years of hindsight, we know that World War I was utterly pointless and unnecessary. All that death, blood, gore, pain, suffering, amputations, disfigurements, blindness, sadness, broken families, alcoholism, depression, morphine addiction, PTSD, not to mention all the taxpayer money that was stolen, was all for nothing. Nothing for the average American, but for the bankers and the military corporations, it was a bonanza of riches, and they got to ram through a form of legalized robbery never imagined before: income tax. Why? Because some psychopath stood on a podium and spoke words into a microphone, and then some psychopaths printed some words in a newspaper. Well, our talk inspired Dr. Ron to find an answer, and a few days later, he sent me the following essay. Now, it's a little on the technical side, but afterwards I will offer a summary and show how it ties into spiritual training and discipline. The Tyranny of Words by Dr. Ron Kapp, MD. I have often wondered why humanity's history is filled with stories of war after war after war. Why can we not have world peace? I now know a logical answer to that perplexing question that has baffled philosophers, politicians, and often even the common man on the street. I came to this answer in a moment of insight. I study the human brain for a living. The human brain, that 2 pounds of complex, interconnected, synaptic, gelatinous mass filled with neurohormones that still baffles and confounds modern science. Our brain has been often described as the final frontier of medicine, our last, virtually unexplored ocean of cellular complexity that is now revealing profound secrets of who we are, where we came from, and perhaps someday an answer to why we are here in the first place. Mankind evolved over millions of years, from the most primitive slime to the most complex synergistic physiology ever imagined. Our brain alone is composed of over 89 billion individual neuronal cells, each with upwards of 10,000 or more synaptic connections in a spider-like web that produces consciousness, deep thought, and a panoply of emotions that run the gamut from love to hatred. That cellular hardware responds to a cauldron of biochemical systems that connect our microbiome to our heart, our lymphatics to our muscles, our periphery to our central nervous system. The Australopithecus brain of Lucy was only 750 cubic centimeters in size. Cro-Magnon's brain exceeded 1,500 cubic centimeters. And while ours now only approximates 1,300 centimeters on average, it is our magnificent and refined prefrontal cortex that allows us to have reached the top rung of the food chain. And yet, we have war after war. The answer to this profound paradox rests in our innate and inherited physiology. As does every organism, from the lowly virus to man, we are meant to reproduce and survive. This is our destiny as a species. Survival is an instinct. It has been inbred over eons of evolution into each and every cell of our body. Our DNA has a destiny to reproduce, as does the exogenously derived and synergistic mitochondria DNA of our cells that give us our ATP energy, and so too our independent microbiome DNA. Also true and also critical to our survival, the ever-changing bacterial microbiome of our gastrointestinal tract that contains more cells than the entire universe of stars, more neurohormones than sand on the beach, and more immune power than ever imagined. All that human complexity evolved over millions and millions of years simply from a desire to survive. And the primitive control mechanism resides in a part of our brain known as the limbic system, the amygdala. There had to be a control mechanism, some way to make it all work. Survival is primitive, emotions even more so. Minute quantities of neurohormones drive our actions. Neurohormonal control of survival destiny. Enter the evolution of the human brain. Our fabulous and continuing to evolve prefrontal cortex was a much later evolutionary adaptation as we descended from the tree to savanna and became the bipedal creature we are today. Although evolution may often make mistakes and go down blind alleys and dead ends, our primitive limbic genetics persists, for we still need to reproduce and survive as a species. Our prefrontal cortex evolved and still continues its inevitable destiny as the master of intelligence, thought, and creativity. Although we use the words of language as easily as water flows down a mountainside, the inherent complexity of that simple act is the incipient spark of war. Words that flow, genetics that control. Yes, we have isolated the gene of war, the warrior gene, and more, and have now isolated the genetics of anxiety, depression, anger, and today even the epigenetic control of Alzheimer's. The warrior gene, identified in 1993 in an antisocial Dutch family on our X chromosome, produces monoamine oxidase A that upsets the balance of dopamine, serotonin, and more. Or perhaps the CDH13 gene, involved in intercellular signaling in several psychiatric illnesses such as autism, bipolar, schizophrenia, and psychopathology. But what does it all mean? Is genetics our destiny, or can mankind override our inherited burden of caveman survival? Ah, therein lies my nugget of insight, a spark of thought that was first described by the ancient Egyptians, refined by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff in his quote, "The first reason for people's slavery is our ignorance, and above all, our ignorance of ourselves," and today infinitely solidified by Lee Yeoman in his thoughts about the French philosopher Foucault. Quote, "But I have also come to think that there is great power in words, and mightier than the sword." Foucault speaks of multiple sources of power and multiple hierarchies. The more parallel hierarchies, the better. The more viewpoints, the more nuance we comprehend. Perhaps I just love words and believe in the perfect placement of a preposition or just the right adjective. Is it the poet in me that dreams he can win over, like Benjamin Franklin, the masses with eloquence? Of course, he was loved more in France. Certainly, the tyranny of words can be powerful, but why? My neurological nugget says that the words we speak, write, and even think are processed by that prefrontal cortex that I mentioned above, the thinking, intellectual part of our brain. But, and it's a big but, the meaning of those words is processed by our primitive limbic neurons of the amygdala and the caudate, and the entire emotional survival system of our brain. The meaning becomes survival. My nugget. A cave-dwelling family was sitting around a small fire. Someone, it mattered not who, uttered an unintelligible sound, perhaps an ugh, maybe even a word. As the others listened, the sound of ugh registered in their emotional centers. Their basal ganglia cells were stimulated. That person sounded ugh, and then by happenstance, that same ugh voice brought to the cave some food. A leader was born. A leader will help us survive. A leader will show us the way. A leader can do no wrong. Humans, by nature, are followers. We seek the leader to lead. Everyone wants survival. However, mankind's prefrontal cortex was yet to develop in that enlightened cave. Following was easy, for most had little thought of anything but survival and follow the leader. It happened then because there was no neuronal connection between the emotional neurons and the prefrontal thinking neurons. Survival came before thinking. It had to. Those prehistoric sounds, precursors to words and language, were the means of survival. The same exact, unchanged, unaltered, and prehistoric neurology persists today. The meaning of words become registered in our primitive emotional limbic system. There is no connection to the prefrontal thought processes of analysis and interpretation. There is then a profound neurological disconnect between these two cerebral regions, the limbic versus the prefrontal cortex, and the limbic emotions win out every time, for that is what survival of the species demands. And for that we have war after war after war. The tyranny of words draws the followers like a bear to honey. There is no thought, no analysis, no reflection. Warriors, for the entire history of mankind, have been blindly driven by their primitive brain cells being stimulated by a few choice words. No amount of thought, debate, logic, or intellectual discussion will ever dissuade a warrior from his or her survival beliefs. That is the tyranny we must all overcome. Summary. In my book, The Way of the Warrior, I talk about the fact that humans have 3 individual brains, often called centers in various spiritual philosophies. They are roughly defined as the intellectual, the emotional, and the instinctive centers. One result of having 3 brains is that we all suffer, to some degree, from multiple personality disorder. In psychiatry, the treatment for MPD is to integrate the various personalities. In spiritual training, the treatment is to integrate the three brains into a single unit. Both have the goal of helping the person to become one. As Dr. Ron stated, language is processed by both the intellectual center, or the prefrontal cortex, and the emotional center, or limbic systems. As I wrote in my book, the three centers work at different speeds. The fastest is the instinctive center. The next fastest is the emotional center, and the slowest is the intellectual. This is where part of the problem lies. Long before the intellectual center can analyze the logic and rationale behind the words, the emotional center has already responded to key words that triggered a pre-programmed response. This is often called a knee-jerk reaction, and why people lose their temper. The programmed response is so intense, it drowns out the input from the prefrontal cortex. It short-circuits the ability to think clearly. This fact is the basis for the combat strategy of antagonizing your opponent. If your enemy is enraged, he can't think clearly and won't see the ambush, the trap, or other subtle strategy you are using. Fear, anxiety, and stress are other programmed responses that will affect your ability to think. This is why our governments and their media propaganda divisions are constantly promoting fear porn. By inducing constant fear, our governments hope you will not be able to think rationally and figure out that we are ruled by psychopaths intent on our slavery. There is one more piece to the puzzle of human behavior. In my chapter on visualization, I cite the well-documented research that shows the brain cannot differentiate between external sensations and internal visualization. There is a slight mistake in this statement. It's not the entire brain that cannot differentiate it. It's the limbic and nervous system. The prefrontal cortex can. This is why visualization works. The intellectual center can create images that can train the emotional responses because the limbic system interprets the imagery as reality. This is the crux of the problem. Unless a person has self-awareness, words are reality. This leads to the absurd concept that people are offended by words, that certain words are a crime, hate speech, that words are assault and abuse of human rights, and now even silence is violence. Words are at best an abstraction. The fact that people cannot differentiate between reality and words inspired sophistry and the psychopathic science of neuro-linguistic programming. Psychopaths study which words and combination of words will best trigger the pre-programmed response so as to more effectively manipulate people. I and many other truth warriors have been saying that the war between humanity and the parasite psychopaths is in great part a spiritual war. Unless you follow a spiritual path that seeks to integrate the three centers, that seeks to make you one, you will always be a victim of lies, propaganda, and manipulation. Those that do not follow such a path are worse than useless in this great battle for humanity and will eventually become collateral damage. Thank you for listening to this rather technical talk. Dr. Ron has sent me an additional 2 essays, and if you would like me to narrate them as well, please leave a comment below. Thank you.